Dave Palumbo here with an RXMuscle rant. Today's topic is, are the bodybuilders of yesteryear as good, better, or worse than the bodybuilders today? Isn't that the ongoing, raging debate we've been having for years now? Rich Gaspari posted a video the other day comparing Hadi Choopan's back to Dorian Yates back when Dorian won the Olympia in '92, which I can't even believe was how many, what is that, 30 years ago? It seems insane when you think about it right now that it's been that long ago, but it has. I remember when he won that show. And, you know, it's really an unfair comparison. Number one, it's hard to take snapshots of two different eras and put them next to each other. I will say this, however. Dorian Yates was probably the hardest working bodybuilder of anyone in the history of the sport. That's not to say that other guys didn't train just as hard, but Dorian had like virtually no life. I mean, his life was focused on bodybuilding. He didn't do anything else. He didn't go out and socialize with people. He really didn't even travel that much to different appearances. He would go there and he would, go in, do the appearance and leave. You would never catch Dorian Yates, going to an after party or something like that while he was competing. And Dorian had this monk-like mentality of, no one's going to outwork me, ever. And he maximized his genetic potential. And he was a big believer in bringing in ultra shredded conditioning. That's what he was known for. And that's the reason he really beat guys back in the day like Levrone and Nasser and Paul Dillette and Flex Wheeler and Cormier and Sean Ray and all those guys. He beat guys who genetically were superior to him because he put more muscle on than them and he brought better conditioning than them. And you could not do anything more than what this guy did. And these other guys just didn't have that mentality. And that's why he was so good. So it's really hard to compare conditioning from Dorian to the conditioning to someone else. That's not necessarily a fair thing because Dorian probably would have been beat by Ronnie Coleman when Ronnie was at his best. I believe he would have. Only because I think Ronnie had better genetics than him. And he had great conditioning. And even though, Dorian's conditioning was a little better, Ronnie's physique was better, genetically speaking. And, at the end of the day, all things equal, genetics sometimes are what, are the difference between winning and coming in second place. We all know that. Flex Wheeler had better genetics than Dorian, but Flex Wheeler was never in the kind of condition that Dorian was in. And Dorian had the size advantage over him. So if you're not going to come in with perfect conditioning and you're going to be a little smaller, even though structurally you might be better, you're not going to win. Hadi Choopan was the best man on the Olympia stage last 2 weeks ago at this point. That's undeniable. I don't think anyone would argue with that. Is he the best Mr. Olympia of all time? No, but he beat everyone who he had to beat in that lineup. Derek ostensibly might have had better conditioning than him, Derek Lunsford. But Hadi had more muscle. And at the end of the day, it is a bodybuilding show. But Hadi's conditioning was good enough. Hadi was coming in here thinking that he was going to have to knock off Ramy. So he came in bigger than he normally does, which may have worked to his advantage. I don't know. And he still had spectacular conditioning. He just didn't have the conditioning that we'd seen in years past because he was worried that he would not be big enough to challenge Ramy. He didn't know that Ramy was going to come in a little off and was going to wind up in fifth place. And, Nick Walker was bigger than Hadi Choopan, but Hadi, brought a better overall look, muscle maturity-wise. That's not to say that Nick Walker won't crucify and crush Hadi Choopan in 2-3 years from now, because Nick's still a young guy and he's still growing and he's still developing, he's still getting muscle maturity and his muscles are still rounding up. So it's really not, appropriate to compare eras and physiques that never stood next to them on the same stage. We can talk about, physiques in terms of what physiques might have been better. I don't think Nasser El-Sombody would have lost to this lineup when he was at his best. But he had mass, he had conditioning, and, we don't see physiques like that. He was structurally better than a Nick Walker. Nasser had a kind of a small waist, a huge wide shoulders, and he had a oodles amount of mass on him. And when he would come in shredded conditioning like he did at the '97 Olympia that he should have won, he would have, I believe, won this show. So, you could make comparisons from all eras like that, but at the end of the day, What is bodybuilding about? It's about judging what is up there on that stage on that day. You can never take the best physique of someone's and say, oh, he would have won the Olympia, because you know what? If I did that with Flex, or if I did that with Levroni, or if I did that with Sean Ray, and I put them against certain bodybuilders from certain eras, yeah, they would have won. They would have won, but they weren't in the show. And they didn't show up with that conditioning. I mean, Cedric McMillan won the Arnold Classic. If he ever showed up at the Olympia with that conditioning, he might have won the Olympia, but he didn't. So you cannot, it's about performance too. Look at a football team. You could, on paper, have the greatest football team of all time with the greatest players, every position pegged, and then they can go and they can lose. You can't pinpoint the best physique and compare it against the current guy who won the Mr. Olympia and say, he's better. It's not an apt comparison. You can only compare yourself against who you're on stage with. Hadi Choopan won the Olympia because he was the best man on stage. Does that mean that this era, or 2022, is worse bodybuilder competitor-wise than 1992 was? No, it just means that that's who is on stage on this day. I get news for you. If all the guys who were in the lineup in the Olympia 2 weeks ago were in the best shape of their life, it might have been the greatest Olympia of all time. Guys didn't nail it. I don't know why. I don't know why guys came in off and flat, and maybe nerves, maybe they overcarbed. I don't know what the reason was. But I think that this era of 2022 going into 23, the bodybuilders today are the biggest guys in the history of bodybuilding, bar none. I mean, we have guys 300 pounds competing on stage. I mean, granted, Ramy probably should have been 10 pounds lighter, but it's still, this is the biggest era of bodybuilding. The bodybuilders are all routinely in the 260s, to 280s, with some guys, teetering on 300. We never saw this in the history of bodybuilding. There might have been one guy that stuck, like Dorian would stick out competing at 260. I mean, and everyone else was much, much smaller than him usually. So, of course, people are going to make comparisons. And I think Rich was just trying to show that, hey, you know what, I'd like to see the conditioning we saw back in the 90s on these physiques of this era. I think, because I do agree with him in the sense that guys are trying to come in too big. They're trying to come in too round they're trying to substitute fullness with not enough muscle. So in other words, oh, I'm not big enough, so I'll just come in fuller and I won't be as hard, but the muscles will look, bigger because I'm going to come in a little bit more carved up. I'm going to come in a little bit more water on the muscle. That doesn't cut it at the Olympia level, guys. You might be able to win a local show like that, but when a guy like Derek Lunsford, who was the 212 Olympia champ last year, 212 pounds, comes into this show and almost wins the Olympia, that's telling you that conditioning wins shows. He was the most conditioned guy in that show. That's not even debatable. Everyone knows that Lunsford was the most ripped guy on that stage. And he was rewarded because of it. And he has a beautiful structure, and he has a lot of muscle. Imagine him with 10 pounds more muscle on that body. It's going to be hard to beat. You got to bring the conditioning. You got to bring the muscle. You can't substitute water and carbs for muscle that you don't have. Go back to the drawing board and put more muscle on. Never sacrifice conditioning on a bodybuilding stage. Always bring your best. Always bring your best conditioning. Don't ever have an excuse like, oh, I'm only 95%. No, come in at 100% every time you step on stage. Have respect for yourself. Don't ever get onto a stage, even if it's a warm-up show, at less than your best. Always show the judges the best that you have. Dexter Jackson did that almost every single time he was out there. Nick Walker does that. Okay? I can list off a couple people that always show up in shape. And you know what? Those people are the ones who consistently do the best. Because other people don't come in at their best all the time. Okay? Nick Walker came in third place in this Olympia. He could have won this Olympia. I don't think anyone would have complained. Hadi was a little better. Derek was structurally a little better than him. But Nick will keep improving, and he will never come in out of shape. And you know what? One of these days, he may win the Olympia. Because maybe Derek won't make it 1 year. He'll get hurt. Or Hadi, will get too old and his physique will not hold up for another 5 years. Guys like Nick Walker will step in there and win the big shows, the Arnold and maybe an Olympia. And it's going to be because of his consistency. So if there's any take-home message from this rant, it's guys, show up in shape. No excuses. Come in dry. Don't worry about trying to be bigger. Okay, bigger is great in the off season. That's when it's time to put the muscle on. When you go into the show time and you're getting lean and getting ready to step on that stage, you better step on stage at the lowest conceivable body fat that you can possibly muster up. Because you know what? That's going to dictate how well you do in the end. The judges are impressed by conditioning. If you don't see that after this past weekend, then I don't know what's going to convince you. But if you can talk to any judge out there and say, what would you rather see, a bigger, fuller physique or a ripped, shredded physique? Every single time they're going to say ripped and shredded. All right, guys, let me know what you think about what I'm saying here in the comments below. I love to hear all opinions, whether you hate me, love me, whatever the case may be. But I will tell you this. I tell you the truth when I say get your butts in shape, show up at your best, and I promise you, you will be rewarded for it. Dave Palumbo with an RX Muscle rant.